Good morning, family.
Good morning.
I would rather try to tell you a story. I'm reading what my dad wrote, but I want to tell you about what our life was like almost 54 years ago. We were living in a small college town, Waverly, Iowa, population between 4,500 and 5,000. And my parents made a decision to adopt my brother Larry, and I'll tell you about that. And the town reacted with all kinds of indignation. There was talk of riots. The head of the Realty Association came to my dad and said that it was a white town and they didn't want any black people in that town. There was one black service member who lived there with his wife, became friends of my parents. But they said that they needed to leave town to continue to have it be a white town. And it didn't deter my parents, but it was a hard road. And so Lynn Ozencup, who was the organist, came to my dad after they brought home the second baby. The first one, Larry, was March of 1962, and then in March of 1963, we went back and got another baby. So Lynn came to my dad on a Wednesday after second baby came home and said, "You need to do something. It may be too late, but this town is in uproar and they need an explanation." So this isn't a typical sermon, but this is the answers to some of the questions that my dad had. Lynn introduced my dad that Sunday and started with this. "The only reason I'm speaking here today is to assure you that any personal references in our pastor's sermon today are not of his own choice, but are given by request. When last Tuesday morning I talked to Reverend Miller, he said, well, we drove to Sioux City yesterday and made our final report on Larry and brought home another baby. Some of the surprised day said, aren't you undertaking a great deal? Reverend Miller went on to tell me all the circumstances surrounding the taking of both Larry and this baby, back from the time several months before they took Larry, when they consulted a psychiatrist in Mason City relative to the possible effect of a child of mixed blood up to the present time. And Reverend Miller had finished and said there, when he said, I said, this is your sermon for Sunday. A friend remarked to me a few days ago, if I could tell all I know in confidence about Reverend Miller helping people, we would all be very thankful that we have such a man in Waverly. And I will say that the congregation that Dad came into had an attendance of about 165 on a given Sunday morning, and it increased to, what was it, almost 400, 395 or whatever by the time we left. But there was a lot of hate and resentment and hypocrisy in that church also. If sacrifice is the road to leadership and the parsonage family is way ahead of us, they make me ashamed of my own selfishness. One instance of their helpfulness occurred when Reverend Miller was pastor at Greeley, Iowa. Sunday after Sunday, a poorly dressed young man would attend the service sitting in the back row and leave before anybody got a chance to speak to him. Reverend Miller made up his mind that he would meet with him, and he hurried out a side door around to meet the man before he left. This led to a visit to the young man's home, which was found to be a one-room shack lit by a dim incandescent lamp. Both father and mother were alcoholics, and there was a handicapped 8-year-old daughter for whom the mother was obliged to care for when he wasn't in school. After a while, the father lost his job, and he and his wife decided to move to Dubuque to look for another one. They didn't care whether their son went with him, and Reverend Miller offered to let the young man come and live with them. The boy accepted, and Reverend Miller said he would be over that afternoon to pick him up with his belongings, and he met him outside with all of his worldly possessions, one shirt tucked under his arm. This was about 2.5 months after Mel and Ruth were married. To make a long story short, Jerry went to Simpson College and on to theological school and graduated as a minister of the Methodist Church. He went on to serve 3 churches in Wisconsin. This happened because Mel and Ruth took him into their home, and I pray that we may listen to our pastor this morning with sympathy and understanding. And, you know, even as a 5-year-old child, I remember what this was like and how it felt. First of all, I would like to tell you a bit about my philosophy of life, for which I am indebted to the late Dr. David Berger, one of my professors. One day he said to his students, "I hope you will never have any great ambitions for yourself. This may be quite contrary to what most people are telling you, but I hope you will never aspire to be the pastor of a large church or a district superintendent or a bishop. I only hope that you will do your best from day to day, wherever that may be, and then God, who knows you better than you know yourself, will present the challenge and opportunities he wishes you to accept. Therefore I say, do not have any great aspirations for yourself, but on the other hand, never say no to an open door. Never turn your back on an opportunity which God presents." This seemed like excellent counsel, and I decided to make it my philosophy of life. And I think I can truthfully say that I did, until 7 years later when I got the notion that it might be more challenging to serve in foreign missions than be at home. I subsequently contacted our Board of Missions, and they informed me there was an opening in Brazil for someone with a background and qualifications comparable to mine. So I applied, but nothing came of it. Soon after this, I learned there was an opportunity to work with the youth in West Germany. Again, I made application, but because of the regulations imposed after World War II, the United States did not see fit to let me go. German guy that he was. Then once again, during my pastorate at Clemmy, I made an application to the Board of Missions for an opening that existed in India, and this time I was interviewed by the bishop, who happened to be in our area. After the interview, he said that 30 years was too old for a person to be an acceptable candidate for foreign service. My wife and I already had 3 children, and this would have been a considerable liability as far as the mission was concerned. But more than that, he said my tongue was too thick and my ear too deaf to learn Indian dialect. And then he said something which reminded me of what my philosophy of life was, that there may be fields of service where you can do greater work than you could possibly do in a foreign field. And so with that in mind, we continued serving where we were. Soon thereafter, we were greatly inspired by a fellow pastor and his wife who were providing foster care for orphan children. The thought came to us that perhaps that's what we needed to do, but nothing became of that. Then we went to visit friends in Janesville for a Lenten service, and after the services, we visited with Reverend Mrs. David Saunders. They have 5 children, 4 of them mixed race, and during the conversation, Mrs. Saunders said to Ruth, "You wouldn't like a little Indian girl, would you?" And Ruth replied, "Well, we've been thinking for some time of taking a homeless child, but I don't really know." And with that, the conversation turned to another subject. As soon as we left, Mrs. Saunders wrote a letter to Florence Critton at home in Sioux City, and she said, "Why don't you contact the Millers? They seem interested in having another child, and perhaps they would make a home for the little girl you told me about." This was on a Wednesday evening, and by Saturday we received an application. We weren't quite sure what to do with it, but then we could see no harm in filling it out, and so we dropped it in the mail. By Tuesday morning, we had an invitation to go to Sioux City to see a baby. They requested we come on Friday, but the day following Easter, we drove to Sioux City and saw the little girl they were trying to find a home for. When they asked her if we would like to have her, I said, "Now please don't misunderstand. We do not necessarily want more children. If we did, we could likely have them on our own. And certainly we don't wish to be in competition with any couple desiring to have a baby. But if you have a child that will be homeless unless we take him or her, we are interested." The caseworker replied that within the past few days, a couple had shown interest in the Indian girl and would probably take her. But they said, "There's a little Johnny here we haven't found a home for. Normally, we let our babies go at the end of 14 days, but he's been here for nearly 5 months. We have 72 prospective couples have looked at him, and when they see the dark color of his skin, they turn away. You see, Johnny is half Negro." And there was little Johnny, the boy we now have, and we named Larry. And when we realized he had never been out of the nursery, never been out of the little bassinet, he'd already outgrown, that he'd never seen a man, breathe fresh air, had a toy, had anyone but his nurse pay attention to him, we couldn't turn away. And all this, though this wasn't normal procedure, they permitted us to take him that very day. And I remember going in, my sister and I was 5 and she was 4. We weren't in school yet. So we went in, and it was a big room with bassinets lined up with these little white babies who, as soon as they were released, they were adopted. And Larry filled the bassinet, and my mom picked him up, and she said, "I'm not leaving him here another night." And she didn't let go, and she wasn't going to leave him. And it was not done. And we took that baby home that day with not a bottle, not a blanket, nothing. And when we got home, my brothers were very surprised. There was 4 of us in 5 years, so they were 6 and 7 probably. And the way my family was introduced to, the extended family, Ben, who was probably 7, called up my dad's parents and said, "Grandma, we have a new baby." And she said, "Well, is it a puppy?" And he said, "No." And, "Is it a kitty?" "No." And she said, "Well, what is it then?" And he said, "It's a baby people." And my dad's family were very gracious and very generous about my parents' decision. My mother's family, I would say, less so. She lost a relationship with her brother, and that never was resolved, and it was kind of an awkward 54 years or so. Anyway, now there are many questions that are directed to us, and I would like to speak to those. The one question most frequently asked is, why did you do it? Well, basically, to give a homeless child a home. But won't you have problems? Of course we will. We fully anticipate problems. Why not? All people have them. But won't Larry's problems be worse? Perhaps they will be, but we believe that we can give him the love and security of a home. He will be able to meet them and to lick them just as you and I do ours. I usually try to explain that long before we had the privilege of having Larry in our home, after being rejected by the Board of Admissions, I visited with a psychologist friend in Mason City and told him of our desire to adopt a homeless child or 2. I asked him what the implications might be and what the psychological implications might be. And I read this now and I think of all the questions, all the bombardment, all the people not waiting on my mother when she went to a store, when she had Larry with her, the hate, and here you are trying to deliver a response to all this hatred, and these answers seem so mild. But how do you tell a congregation who feels like they've been betrayed? They don't want a black person in their church. They were happy the way they were. His immediate reply was, "I would say that this is the most wonderful thing you could do and perhaps the greatest thing you will ever do in your ministry." For he said that while it's true that all homeless children have special problems which are basically emotional and psychological, the children who are of mixed blood have even more. But he explained that if a child can know the security and the love of a home with a father and mother and sisters and brothers for the first 6 or 7 years of life, he will be psychologically equipped to meet any of the roadblocks that life might throw in his way. However, if he grows beyond these years and does not have the love and security of a home, he will never feel secure. He will never completely trust people. As a result, he will be shy and reserved, or he will try to compensate for his inferiority by becoming a braggart and a bully. He may even exhibit criminal tendencies in an attempt to prove himself. So he said, if you can provide a home, if only for a few years, you will, in my estimation, at least be fulfilling a great ministry. We remembered these words when we invited Larry into our home. We hope soon to adopt him. And I think about the inviting and what we did, and as I said, it wasn't a decision that was made. We went up to talk about this little Indian girl, and there was never had been a discussion about a black child. It was just, you couldn't leave a child who hadn't been touched except to have his very basic needs met, and that was food and clothing, and that's about it. And I think at 5 months, it was kind of late. Larry was so quiet. He didn't make a sound, not a peep, not a cry, not anything for, I think, 3 or 4 days. Wondered if there was something wrong, but there was no point in him making any noise. He'd never gotten a response to anything. And then when he did respond, we called him the little monkey boy because he clung around my mother's neck and wouldn't let anybody else touch him or hold him. And I remember her driving with him, hanging around tightly around his neck, her neck. But why did you get another? Well, as Lynn had explained, we went back for our final visit last Monday, and 10 days previous to that, the caseworker had written to remind us that the time was drawing for our final visitation, and she also mentioned that they had another child of mixed race who was part Spanish and American Indian for whom they had no home. She believed he would fit well into our family. His hair was straight and black, and his skin was medium dark, and he was born on December 30th, 1962. Needless to say, we did a lot of hard thinking during those 10 days and consulted our friends. They already had the situation they had. It couldn't really be worse, and they thought that Larry needed somebody to be his brother. What should we do? The question loomed so prominent in our minds that we couldn't sleep. And again, Ruth would ask, what should we do? But by tomorrow night, the decision will be made. What will it be? We tried to weigh the various considerations as logically and realistically as possible. And finally, we said, well, we believe in the open door. Let's just find out what happens when we get there. Perhaps our hearts will help our minds make a decision. We took our children with us. The 4 oldest had already assured us they would gladly make whatever sacrifices would be necessary to have another baby. They expressed their willingness to share their clothes and toys and to do with a little less so that a child could have a home, realizing the potential so this child could have the potential that they should have. For this, we were grateful. And needless to say, when we saw the new baby and realized that his destiny was determined by our saying yes or no, we could not say no. So we brought him home and named him Mark William. And we went in there thinking we were getting our other baby people. And Mark was the polar opposite of Larry. At 2.5 months, he was the pet of the nursery. He was bubbly and happy and smiling, and there's no way you wouldn't just say this is the brother. But he helped Larry. He really did, because he was so outgoing and Larry was so reserved. Another question that has frequently been asked, especially since we have Mark, is why did you put this additional burden on your wife? Well, again, I would like to emphasize that this was not just my idea. This was a family decision. Furthermore, we don't feel that she will be burdened much more than she already is. We intend to share the family responsibility. For instance, last Saturday, I went home for lunch a little earlier than usual, and when I walked in the house, Debbie was vacuuming the front room, David was dusting the furniture, Benji was setting the table and making a salad, and Ruth was attending to Larry. Mark was asleep. So we feel that by giving our other children responsibility, which they may not have had before, we are not only teaching them very valuable lessons of life, but we are also teaching them appreciation for some of the blessings they do have. So as Larry was my mother's baby, Mark was mine. So at 6, I had my own baby. She could only do one at a time, but so my baby brother was like my own baby brother, my own baby, and I was 6. Last Saturday morning, a social worker from Waterloo spoke to the members of the Youth Fellowship, including a statement by Judge Philip Gillum, the judge of the juvenile court in Denver, Colorado. It's an open letter to a teenager, and this is what he said. And I think, Dad, how you were looking for answers wherever you could find them, and this is what you came up with. So this judge is telling these kids, always we hear the plaintive cry of the teenager, what can we do? Where can we go? And the answer is go home. Hang the storm windows, paint the woodwork, rake the leaves, mow the lawn, shovel the walk, wash the car, learn to cook, scrub the floors, repair the sink, build a boat, get a job, on and on and on. Your parents do not owe you entertainment. Your village does not owe you recreation facilities. The world does not owe you a living. You owe the world something. You owe it to your time and energy and your talents so that no one will be at war or in poverty or sick or lonely again. In plain, simple words, grow up, quit being a crybaby, get out of your dream world, develop a backbone, not a wishbone, and start acting like a man or lady. I think that message speaks for itself. This question also is frequently asked. Why do you deny your children that which should be their rightful heritage? Again, may I say, we don't feel we are denying them a thing. As far as an estate goes, I never had one, and I don't really expect to have one. Had that been my ambition, I sure would have chosen a different profession than ministry. Our children have inherited a good body and a good mind, and given a proper education, there isn't anything in the world or any reason they shouldn't be able to make something of themselves. Oh, it is true, they may have to work their way through college, but that won't hurt them in the least. I worked a good deal my way through college, and even though it took me 3 years longer, I've convinced myself I've learned many invaluable lessons which I couldn't have learned in the classroom. Lessons which would be more beneficial to anyone. If this is the price of an education for my children, I am sure it will do them good rather than harm. Furthermore, there is real value in interracial living. We expose our children to various philosophies of life. They study different political ideologies at school. We expect them to know the tenets of the major religions of the world, but seldom do we equip them psychologically for life and work with members of other races. We feel that our children have an excellent opportunity in their own home to discover that God has made of one blood all nations and that pigmentation is only skin deep. As a consequence, we expect that whether they be at college or in the service of their country or in a vocation, they will be able to work harmoniously with anyone regardless of the color of their skin. In the process, it is likely that they too will be victims of prejudice and misunderstanding, but this should only make them stronger men and women. Again, Judge Gilliam has something to say, and I quote, and my dad almost always had a poem in his sermons. This is called Good Timber. The tree that never had to fight for sun and sky and air and light, that stood out on the open plain and always got its share of rain, never became a forest king, but lived and died, a scrubby thing. That man who never had to toil, who never had to win his share of sun and sky and light and air, never became a manly man, but lived and died as he began. Good timber does not grow in ease. The stronger wind, the tougher trees, the further sky, the greater length, the more the store, the more the strength. By sun and cold, by rain and snows, in tree or man, good timber grows. Where thickest stands the forest growth, we find the patriarchs of both, and they both converse with the stars, whose broken branches show the scars of many winds and much of strife. This is a common law of life. This is well and good, but how do you afford it? I don't know. All I am sure of is that where there's a will, there's a way. One time we'd considered adopting a Korean child, but it cost $1,000 to fly them here. By the same token, all it cost us was the gas money to go get him. I don't know that there are some people in this congregation who feel that we must have paid at least $500 in order to get a child. We did not. Since this is the case, perhaps some of you would like to take a child into your home. There are, I know, over 400 in our state at the present time who have no place to call home and have no one to call mom or dad. The final question is this, and it was raised last Thursday by a very good friend of mine. I was surprised that he would raise it at all, but he did. The question is, why do you bother with other people's kids when you have some of your own? The only thing I could say was, suppose you were one of those children, one who had no parents, and you were simply left, given birth and left at the scene, your destiny to be determined by the mercy of someone else. Would you not more than anything else hope to be taken into a home? Why did we do it? Well, basically because we love children, because children have no other homes, and we like to think that God is in this with us, and that one day he will say, inasmuch as you have done unto one of these, least you have done unto me. And they went on then to be asked to leave the community and sent to another town, and then they were asked to adopt more children and said they couldn't adopt more, but that we would take these children so they wouldn't be lying in a bassinet until they were 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 months old. And so we took them into our home to foster them until they were adopted. And the last child, there was a brochure called Hillcrest Calling that had a picture of our last. We had Jean, after Jean McCarthy, we had Julian. After Julian Bond, Julian was 9 months when he was finally adopted. He was in Hillcrest Calling, and it was hard because he was walking and saying mommy and daddy, and it was hard to think about giving him up. But after his picture was in the brochure, I think there were 40 plus applications for him. And Julian ended up being adopted by a pastor friend of my parents, and when I was in high school, I babysat for him. His name was Bryce then. But my siblings and I remember being asked, we had a big family meeting talking about what it would mean for us to have another child and living on a minister's salary. If any ministers back remember what those salaries were, they weren't very much. We had a lot of assistance from my dad's parents with food, and we... $2,400. Yeah, I knew it wasn't very much, Dad.
Don't give them any ideas.
But it was a family decision, which certainly shaped my lives and all my siblings. But it also started to change the climate in Iowa. And within 5 or 6 years of those adoptions, my friends my family's friends, my parents' friends, almost all had adopted. Florence Crittenden Home was closed down. There was no need for an orphanage. Then there was a shortage of babies, and the climate has slowly changed. And as I say, 54 years I thought it brought us a long way, and now I'm worried about what we can continue to do to not take a lot of steps backwards. But thank you for listening.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.